Hey, and happy Tuesday. I am Ryan Duffy, managing editor of Payload and your host. On today's episode of Pathfinder, we are speaking with Katherine Boyle, a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz, or a16z. Katherine heads up a16z's American Dynamism practice and recently led the firm's investment in Hadrian. Beyond serving as a GP at a16z, Katherine is a prolific writer and deep thinker on all things aerospace, defense, U.S. national interest, dual-use technology, and Washington and Silicon Valley being friends. We'll get into it, but first, a word from our sponsor. Our reliance on satellites for navigation, communications, commerce, and intelligence has grown exponentially in the new space economy. Unfortunately, the risks have grown as well, and the need to prioritize cybersecurity around space assets is critical. Spider Oak Vision Systems provides space cybersecurity products for military, commercial, and civilian operators. Their Orbit Secure solution is the first to deliver zero trust security to zero gravity environments, protecting space communications, command, control, data transmission, storage, and integrity at the data level. To learn more about Orbit Secure, check out their website at spideroak-ms.com. Again, that's spideroak-ms.com. But wait, we are not done yet. Two more things before we dive in. Number one, in this conversation, I have a pretty bad rash on my face, and that is from a VR headset and working out in it. Apparently, sweat and silicone don't go very well together. So enjoy that if you are watching on YouTube and Spotify. And item number two is a disclaimer courtesy of our friends at a16z. Here we go. The content here is for informational purposes only and should not be taken as legal, business, tax, or investment advice, or be used to evaluate any investment or security, and is not directed at any investors or potential investors in any a16z fund. Whew, that was a long top of show, and without further ado, Pathfinder Episode 4 with Katherine Boyle. Katherine, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
I want to establish some common ground. In a past life, you were a reporter at the Washington Post. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So, but you're still a pretty prolific writer, but I suppose you're now a reformed reporter.
As reformed as one can be.
Okay. So how and why did you make the jump into full-time venture investing?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And it's one, it's funny. I was having a conversation a couple weeks ago with someone, and this is actually a really scary fact, but I have now been investing twice as long as I was a reporter. So it feels like ages ago. And a lot of my stories are from the Stone Ages. You know, it's like it was a different time. But I really wasn't a choice for me. So I was at the Washington Post at probably the darkest hour that it has ever existed, right before Jeff Bezos bought the paper. And it was, a time where a lot of, I think, reporters were expecting if they didn't leave, they were going to get fired. And I was a general assignment reporter and had this sort of view of technology that something big was happening, that it was the biggest story of my life. And somehow I was missing it by staying in Washington, not going to Silicon Valley, not understanding it. And so I decided to leave the Post, to go out to Silicon Valley. I applied to business school, was fortunate to get accepted, and then spent the next few years just trying to, I'd say, figure out the story that I saw in front of me. And I can say the thing that was most shocking, and at that time I had, lived all over the world. I considered myself somewhat of a worldly person. I had lived in different cities, and I had never experienced the culture shock that I felt in Silicon Valley, because it was going from a culture of no, a very bureaucratic culture, a very Washington culture where you wait your turn, you prove your worth, you spend 20 years, toiling away in a certain role, and then maybe you'll get your shot at the apple. And Silicon Valley is not that. And so there was this big culture shock of, wow, anyone can do anything here, and everyone says yes to everything, and everyone takes meetings, and it was just a very different culture. But the other shock that I've talked and written a lot about is, my entire kind of framework up until that point had been sort of a Washington-centric, nation-state focused story. Everyone believes in defense. Everyone believes in the country. And when I moved to Silicon Valley, I was stunned that no one read the news. No one seemingly cared about politics. I think that's changed. But it felt like a totally distant culture, but specifically a culture that had no insight into how Washington worked. And I think there were pros and cons to that. The pros of that are it allows people to build fast. People would put their heads down. They wouldn't be focused on the Twitter news cycle. And of course, when I moved, Twitter wasn't the thing it is today. But the con of that is that so much of the innovation that's happened over the last 30 years since we started building the commercial internet is not touching Washington. And it's a function of geography, it's a function of culture, it's a function of just the fact that these two worlds really hadn't been coexisting until very, very recently. And so that was sort of the biggest part of my culture shock in moving to Silicon Valley, was realizing, wow, I feel like I'm in a different world.
So this is a big fund. So tell me a little bit about where you sit within the organization and the investing team.
Certainly. So I joined Andreessen Horowitz 6 months ago now to lead what we're referring to as the American Dynamism practice, which is companies that are explicit in their support of the national interest. And that is everything from sort of classical companies that sell to government, aerospace, defense, public safety, but also companies that are important in their mission to support what Washington and what most Americans think are important public goods. So that's education, it's housing, it's infrastructure, physical infrastructure, namely supply chain, logistics, and transportation. It's the categories that are often the most regulated by Washington. Often they're the political hot button issues that the people are worried about or talking about on the news. But they're also things that government sees as so core to its functions that it either has an executive branch or a mandate to spend time in it. And so aerospace and defense is a huge part of that category. And I'd say a lot of my career has been focused, my investing career has been focused on what we would call this modernization that is happening in the Department of Defense, where there's an understanding that the last 30 years of technological innovations that have been really focused in the in software and Silicon Valley movements, like and new step function changes in technology like artificial intelligence, just really have not touched the DoD. Not because of the technologists don't want to work with the DoD, but because the DoD has not modernized its procurement, has not modernized the set of companies that it is able to work with. So that's been a huge focal point of where I've made many investments, and as part of that, it's broadening our aperture and looking at things like commercial space, which I think in the last 10 years has just exploded for a number of reasons as well.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of Payload readers and Pathfinder listeners would agree with that. It's hard, of course, to name all the variables why there has been this dissonance, but I thought it was really interesting that you mentioned the geographic distance, because that is where my mind went. It seems silly and it seems stupid to think that one's on one coast, one's on the other. But do you think that with the forward march of technology, and even in the last couple of years, when we were still in lockdowns and everything was online, everything was remote, do you think that has narrowed that gap at all, or is there still this tyranny of geography?
Oh, I love this question, because I definitely don't think there's a tyranny of geography anymore. I know I mentioned we're chatting with each other. I'm in the suburbs of Miami right now. A couple years ago that would not have been possible at all. So I'm much closer to the Space Coast in Florida than I am in Silicon Valley, even though I think Silicon Valley in some ways still dominates the way we build companies. So I like to say that Silicon Valley is no longer a place in Northern California. It is an idea. It is a method of company building. And I think that's really important because, you still get these things in Washington of, oh, well, that's West Coast capital, or that's, those are West Coast companies. And it's, there is a method of venture-backed company building that is completely transforming technology, not only for the sectors that have historically Silicon Valley has invested in, the consumer sectors, the enterprise sectors, but it is completely transforming technologies that are going to be of great importance and are of great importance to the government and to the DoD explicitly. And so I think that is what has changed, that a lot of these companies are not based in Silicon Valley. I mean, I think a lot of investments are in, either Southern California, Boston, second, what I call second cities like Atlanta, like places that are just like wonderful places to live, but haven't historically been sort of the nexus of technology.
They don't have the base. Yeah. So in a way, it's kind of an export. I think it's of course very, very apparent, and the pandemic has made it very clear that you can build great companies from anywhere. Now, with the main focus of this conversation, there are limits to that, of course, and A and D. But I think that's pretty fascinating, thinking of that sort of venture-backed company building as kind of an export, but it's no longer by any means confined to the geographical boundaries of California, of course, nor nor was it ever.
Yeah, I mean, we've exported that method of company building to the world as well. I mean, I think venture capital is often, it's seen as sort of this, or it was seen as this niche asset class, this sort of niche way of taking bets on certain types of technologies. But when you think of what's happened over the last 15 years in particular, I mean, it is the dominant way of building the most important companies, not only in the U.S. but in the world. And so there is a, when I talk about kind of like what's the difference between now and why Silicon Valley isn't as dominant as it once was. It's like there are kids in the middle of nowhere who are reading, blogs that have been written over the last 10 years that teach them how to company build. And just the knowledge that is now available to people on the internet from podcasts like yours to, people can now learn about these sectors in a way that just was not possible 10 years ago. And so I think we're really bullish on this democratization of the Silicon Valley company building playbook. And it's happening in LA, it's happening in New York, it's happening in Miami, it's happening all over the country, in Texas, Seattle. I mean, it's really exciting to see this sort of post-COVID shock that has happened, where now every state is going to benefit. And when we get into talking about, government companies or companies that are selling to government, it's really important that these companies are not just based in 2 states, that they are based all over the country.
Yeah, certainly. Now, did you coin the term American Dynamism?
Oh, that's an interesting question. It's a phrase that I've been saying a lot. And I don't actually, you're the first person to ask me this, but I don't know where it came from. It's just something I've said repeatedly, but it's interesting. I'll share a kind of, when David Yulovich and I set out to build this practice, we didn't have a name for it. But he often said, "Oh, well, you say American Dynamism a lot. Maybe we should just call it that." And I was like, "Oh, okay, like that's a great idea." So one of these organic things where kind of everyone knows what it means, but no one can actually put a definition to it. And when you talk about it, for different people, if you're, say, an economist, they have very strict terms of what dynamism means. But if you're someone who isn't coming from a certain discipline, what it sounds like what it is, which is growth, movement, prosperity. Being very focused on making sure that all people in this country are lifted up. And so I think people know what it means. It's one of these words where people understand the feeling of it.
Yeah. It's catchy, but it conveys a certain meaning. And I would bet you probably, I didn't Google it myself. I wasn't engaging in an active gotcha, but I would imagine if this practice, this thesis, this project is successful, there will be a Wikipedia page in 5 years or 10 years, and it'll be like coined by Katherine Boyle.
Well, what I hope, I'll expand on that, because it's funny. This is going to make me sound like I'm not as competitive of a venture capitalist as I actually am. But it is our goal that every firm has an American Dynamism practice. Like, if we are doing our jobs, if we are investing in the right companies, if we're interfacing with the people in Washington, interfacing with the regulators, talking to the right people in Washington, that tech is actually a force for good. It's actually a force for dynamism. It's a force for growth. It's a force of abundance, of making sure that all people in this country have access to the same sorts of methods of company building, but also the fruits of this great type of abundant company building. Then it will become very clear that it should be a practice that every firm has, in the same way that no firm says, "Oh, well, we don't invest in SaaS," or "We don't invest in consumer." So I think every generalist firm that is serious about the real opportunities ahead of us over the next 10, 15 years is going to see this as a practice they have to have.
Yeah. So it's a playbook, and it's not confined to specific sectors or categories. And in this, in a similar vein, I had planned to ask you about atoms and bits. That's the typical abstraction used for the physical and software digital world. And I was going to present it as an either or. And I think that that's a false dichotomy. And I know that you would agree, but can you say a little bit about within these buckets of American dynamism, where there might be a little bit more stagnation, where there are the biggest opportunities to interlay and merge and marry those two?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I love this question, because I do think for a very long time, sort of the war between atoms and bits was presented as you only care about software, or you only care about the virtual world, and you're ignoring the physical world. And that's just not the case. I often point to, one of my favorite founders that I've been fortunate enough to work with is Palmer Luckey, the founder and creator of Oculus, and now the founder of Anduril. And one of the things that he's been so right on from the very beginning is that he's building a hardware company, but he's building the virtual world with it. And so this idea that they don't coexist, or that they can't coexist, or that they shouldn't coexist, I just think it's a false dichotomy and false framework. But one of the things that I talk a lot about is that I think the next 10, 20 years of sort of Silicon Valley company building is going to go into the physical world, and that's because it's inevitable. And even if you look at sort of the canonical pieces that have been written by our founder, Marc Andreessen, what he wrote in 2011 about software is eating the world, that 10 years later or 9 years later, it's time to build. And I think, when you think of like those two things juxtaposed against each other, building is actually seen as a very physical act. And so I think even in our own portfolio of companies that we've invested in, in the last few years, we're seeing sort of this nice hybrid of, sensors have now come down the cost curve to the point where cheap sensors can be integrated into many different types of sectors where it's a software hardware hybrid. There's a number of companies in our portfolio that look like hardware companies on the outside, but they actually function very, very much like software companies in terms of where they're offering leverage and where they're offering automation. And so I think what we're excited about is we are seeing sort of this next wave of innovation truly be software that either, really changes the physical world in some way, or is engaged with bringing cheap hardware and software into some of these legacy sectors where software really hasn't gone.
Yeah, I don't know where this fits within that framework, and I don't remember the exact example, but I do recall hearing this quote many times about looking into a screen and just the amount of change that's happened over 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. Whereas when you look outside, and I live in Austin, Texas, and it's a great city. I love Austin. However, we have a big problem with roads, and it's been a long time coming, and the congestion is getting out. It is already out of control, but it's only going to get worse. And so we're about 20 years behind the ball. So there's this element of infrastructure trailing quite a bit behind all of the exponential curve of technology development. How does that relate to this whole concept of American dynamism?
Yeah, no. So I think it hugely relates, because I think a lot of the categories we're talking about are the most regulated. They are the places where, in living in a autocracy, it's very hard for houses to get built in San Francisco, for example. It's very hard to make changes to physical infrastructure. And I do think when we look back on, okay, why has Silicon Valley been so focused on the virtual world? Well, it's because it's easy to build in the virtual world when you compare it to how difficult it is to get a permit to build something in the physical world. And so what we like to say about like the founders that decide to go into these American dynamism companies is that they are so focused on a mission. And oftentimes, we see a lot of second-time founders that say, okay, now we're going to focus on these missions because we've done something in the virtual world, and now we want to help our communities or help our government or help help the physical world. So I do think in some cases, sometimes it is harder to align because you are working with highly regulated segments of whatever sector. But there's other aspects that I think make these companies really interesting. And it probably relates a lot to some of your aerospace listeners as well, where actually I think the hardest parts of company building for these companies is the early stage. And once you get through, we like to say these companies go deeper down the J curve, but once you get through that part, they often become holding companies. They often become, in some ways, the dominant force for whatever sector they're operating in. And whether we're talking about SpaceX or Flock Safety, which is another company in our portfolio that's focused on public safety, a hardware software company, these companies, once they get to a point of escape velocity, are really they compound, unlike companies that look like pure enterprise or pure consumer companies. And so there's something really interesting about once you get through the hard part of building on the early stage, these companies can become, once in a generation companies.
Right. And let's look at this concept through a space lens. Let's dig into that a little bit. Characterize where we're at with space as you see it through the American dynamism framework.
Yeah. So I think, what you and I were talking right before we came on, and what I think is so interesting is space is not this little like niche area that only the people who have aerospace degrees or aerospace engineering degrees can invest in now. There sort of used to be this like mantra in Silicon Valley, and I actually think it was probably even like 5-7 years ago, right when I moved out, where you would hear people say, "Oh, well, we don't invest in space," in the same way, "Oh, we don't do biotech." Like that's too different. And what I think has changed is that people now realize that there is actually like one there is software that can be built for these sectors. So not everything is about just investing in launch companies. Um, Two, I think there's also just an understanding that these sectors are so massive and important, and that they aren't just these sort of niche areas that used to kind of I'd say trail when compared to sort of like pure enterprise software companies. That I don't think you can ignore them anymore. And I think that's also changed sort of the kind of culture of aerospace entrepreneurs, aerospace investors, where I think people are a lot more open to people who are learning, to people who are interested in the space, and a lot more, I'd say, experimental. I think we've talked. I've written a lot about how government sort of used to dominate a lot of these categories, and there used to be sort of a sense that okay, if the only way that you could operate in whether it's aerospace or defense is you would have to get funds from DARPA, or you'd have to get funds from the government, or you have to be supported by R&D grants, and that you would have to go through this long, arduous process that would really slow you down and hobble you. And I think one of the things that's dramatically changed and led to the just explosion of commercial space companies we've seen is that there is sort of this huge impetus from, I would say, software investors to invest in these companies at the earliest of stages that takes away that barrier of having to apply for grants or having to solely work for the government. That said, what I will say on the flip side is we did see just so many people go into commercial space and almost say, "Oh, we don't ever really, really want to work with government." And I do think that government has become just this extraordinary sort of customer on the back end. That after there's a crazy amount of capital given to a company so that it can explore and do its own R&D, government can be an important first initial customer to help people get through this kind of valley of death that the DoD and that we've often talked about.
When we're talking about highly regulated industries and aerospace in particular, often you see the government as a competitor, but here it's a key customer in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, it is a key customer, and also a customer that I think people shouldn't be afraid to work with. I mean, it's especially on the defense side, where I've spent a lot of time. I think there was sort of this view of okay, you never really you want to be a dual use company, and you want to only work with defense after you figured out your first enterprise customer. When you focus more on the commercial side, and then you can kind of create this little niche area where you have someone who runs Fed sales and it's fine, but your product isn't actually built for the needs and requirements of the Department of Defense. And I think that has changed. Companies like Anduril have changed that. Companies like Palantir, where there's this view, actually, if we build for the requirements of government, not necessarily the written requirements, but the things and capabilities that the government and the warfighter needs, then ultimately, then you can, if in the case of Palantir, then you can go into the commercial sector. In the case of Anduril, you can build a big enough business to just focus on government. And what I do think has happened, and this is part of the American Dynamism thesis, is that you can build companies that are large enough just selling to the U.S. government and selling to the U.S. government and her allies. So that has certainly always been the case in space, but I think that's becoming a broader and just more accepted thesis.
Time for a short break to hear about our sponsors again. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. SpiderOak Mission Systems builds space cybersecurity solutions for civilian, military, and commercial space operations. Their Orbit Secure protocol delivers zero trust security to zero gravity environments, protecting space communication, command, control, data transmission, storage, and integrity at the data level. To learn more about how zero trust architectures will revolutionize security in new space, download the new NSR SpiderOak sponsored white paper titled Space Cybersecurity, Current State and Future Needs. Find the white paper at spacecyber.com. Again, that's spacecyber.com. Or check out their website at spideroak-ms.com. And tell them Pathfinder sent you. I'm glad you mentioned dual use because that's next up on my list. And dual use meaning technology that has civilian and military applications. I think in recent memory, there's been a lot of stories about this. And there has been, as you've alluded to, a reticence among some employee bases to do any work or build any software, tools, what have you, that would be used by the Department of Defense. And I think with some of the companies you just listed, it's clear that it's the complete inversion of that. But I'm also curious what your thoughts are on this year and, the war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Do you think that that has been a catalyst at all for tech workers writ large? And that is quite a generalization, I'm aware, but just generally, the average engineer's inclination to work for these types of dual use companies?
100%. I love this question because I think the media largely got it wrong when they said that Silicon Valley doesn't want to work with the Department of Defense for either moral or ethical or just even reasons of interest. I see so many founders, and this is even before when we get into talking about the war in Ukraine. There was such a momentum to work on these important problems even before that happened. I have a lot of theories as to why that is. I think space became really cool because people like Elon made it cool. Anduril, it was the first company that made building products for the country look really, really cool. And not only are their products interesting, but the pace of innovation is interesting. I think there was sort of this movement over the last few years where actually the most interesting companies are the ones doing hard things with people who actually believe they're going to Mars and who are not waiting their turn. And I think that's a super compelling narrative for young people who want to get involved in building hard things. I do think what I will say there has been a sea change. I first got involved with Anduril in the seed round in 2017, and in Silicon Valley, and this was never on the founder side. I should point this out, never on the founder side. But on the co-investor, just kind of friendly VC side, there were a lot of people with raised eyebrows. How can you invest in something that's going to solely support the Department of Defense? Defense was not seen as something that anyone wanted to get involved in. And it took people who really understood the sector and who also understood the need for defense modernization. And I do think it helped that a lot of the people who were investing in this space had come from Washington, understood that defense is not a partisan issue. It's a bipartisan issue with broad support. It's probably the only thing that most Americans agree on is that we need a strong military and a strong national defense. So that was certainly, I'd say, the norm was that it was seen as a little off. But come 2022, the Financial Times is saying that defense is ESG. That there's sort of a broad support for anyone invested in these categories because of Ukraine. And so I think in some ways it's just proven the point that people had in some ways believed that we were kind of past a world in which nation states mattered. There was sort of this anti-nation state mindset, I think, in 2015, 2016 in Silicon Valley, where it's like, no, we're one world, technology is global, and you can have customers anywhere. And I think that sort of history, if we look back, has proven that that's not the case. And aerospace, I mean, a lot of your listeners will know, I mean, this has always been the case for aerospace. So there's always been sort of, you can only sell to certain countries. It's always been seen as kind of and there's always been seen as sort of a broad understanding of who your friends and enemies are, as much as no one likes to say it. And so I think in some ways the war in Ukraine has sort of just kind of revealed things that used to be unsaid.
Yeah. I should also point out, to add a little bit to that empirically, I recall seeing a poll a couple years ago of FAMGA technical, engineers, and the data indicated that exactly what you're saying, that there wasn't this reticence or there's inclination. But I think with the walkouts and the petitions and everything, it gave the impression that it was more of a monolith when, if anything, the common view among these employee bases was quite opposite. But I do see how that sentiment would pick up and accelerate quite a bit in the past 100 days. I mean, by the time we will be airing this, it will have been 100 days since the invasion is this Saturday. I'm glad that we've already talked a little bit about software, hardware, convergence, company building across the US. And I'm wondering, how can aerospace and defense companies compete with the big tech companies for talent? Because it's going to be really hard to do it on price alone.
So it's interesting because I actually think this is not something that tech company or that aerospace companies have to worry about. Just anecdotally, I spend a lot of time talking to young people who are either dropping out of their PhD programs or asking what they should do in their careers. And the companies they are most excited about are SpaceX, early stage companies in aerospace, Anduril, Hadrian. These companies that are very difficult hardware software challenges, but also just like really important missions where people, I think, feel like they can actually see the benefits of what they are building. And so my view is I don't see that there's going to be any sort of recruitment problem. I mean, even just this is another anecdote, and maybe I'm like going way too in the weeds here. But culturally, I think space has never been cooler, even in places where we don't usually look. So I have a 18-month-old son.
That's the soundbite right there. Culturally, space has never been cooler.
No, it's never been cooler. But I have an 18-month-old son.
I agree.
One of the things that I first noticed when we were like going shopping for him and buying things for his room is space is the like motif that is everywhere in America for children. It's both boys and girls. It's everywhere, but it's not just in certain pockets of America. It's everything from a Burlington coat factory, a TJ Maxx, all the way up to the sexy designer goods you can get off certain boutiques offline. It's like everything is focused on space, and so I think there is something that has switched culturally, where people started looking to the stars again. And you can say, maybe it has maybe it's because SpaceX has done such a great job of marketing themselves over the last few years that people are starting to kind of look up again. Maybe there is sort of this moment in time. There could be a number of different cultural factors that have come together where people are actually starting to look at these hard problems again. Maybe it is because, if you believe the narrative of history has begun again, people really see that the space race will be the last frontier in terms of nation states being able to wield power. There's a number of sort of narratives happening all at the same time. But the downstream effect of that is that little boys and girls across America have stuffed rockets that they're taking to bed, as my son does. So what does that mean? It means we are raising a generation of kids who are excited about going to space again. And so you can't compete with that. Like ad clicking can't compete with that. Enterprise
B2B SaaS.
Yeah,
right.
You can compete with it. So I think I'm very hopeful that the next 10 years of innovation, venture-backed companies will be focused on these really hard problems where people are tired of only working in virtual. They want to see the virtual world melded with the physical. And what better way to do that than to work in space?
No, I agree. And I was asking a provocative question, but I discussed this actually yesterday with another guest who will be episode 3. And she's a former SpaceXer, and we were kind of discussing the same sort of topics. I mean, space definitely wins hearts and minds, and where, these are the most mission driven companies. I think that's very clear. And, it's a lot of hard work, long hours in the trenches, but you are building world changing, world leaving products.
The other thing that I think is important to note too, and part of the reason, if we're talking about culture and we're talking about company building, part of the reason we're so excited about companies like SpaceX and Anduril is because they've been building in public, and they've been teaching a method of company building internally that you now see, people leaving and evangelizing a way of, okay, this is how you stand up a factory. This is how you think about building hardware, software hybrid. Anduril has been very open about how to sell to government, how they think about taking bets on products. It used to be if you were an aerospace or a defense company, you would never share your state secrets because that was how you were going to compete against the other, few primes that also had contracts. But now you see a generation of founders and executives talking about how to work with government, how to build in an effective way. And so the talent isn't just going to academia and kind of thinking about these things in the clouds. They're actually, building at a rapid fire pace and taking that knowledge and building new companies as well. So, in some ways you could say one of the best things that's happened coming out of SpaceX, coming out of Palantir, coming out of Anduril is that there's going to be a generation of young people leaving those companies and building in a methodology that really didn't exist before. And that's going to lead to a host of new companies that are on the same trajectories as these first generation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you've certainly seen that already with the SpaceX mafia, the amount of former SpaceXers who have gone on to just start all these different companies in the commercial space ecosystem. What element does storytelling play here? Because build in public is, I think, more or less synonymous with storytelling, but some of these companies, and this is actually what we will get into next, Hadrian is very good at storytelling. So yeah, walk me, and you're a storyteller yourself, so I had to ask about it.
Well, I love this question because I've long said, and this actually came out of an observation I had when I first started investing, watching a consumer investor that I worked very close with. And one of the things that I said about him and then a lot of his cohort was that they were some of the best mathematicians I'd ever met. And when you talk to someone who knows nothing about consumer investing, they usually think that it must be a really, really cool person who can follow trends. And it's like, no, that's table stakes. Like everyone who invests in consumer is cool, but like the thing that actually sets consumer investors apart is that they're just like exceptional at math and exceptional at understanding unit economics in a way that is not often the case for other types of companies. And I'd say on the flip side of that is when people are on the outside of investing in aerospace, defense, deep tech, they usually think that the people who are investing in that category or the people that are the most dominant must be the best technologists. And of course, that's table stakes. You have to be an exceptional technologist to operate in these sectors. But the thing that I think transformed SpaceX, that transformed Anduril, that transforms these companies is that they have an extraordinary storyteller at the helm who can explain exactly what they're doing, why they're doing it, and create in many ways mini movements that really attract the best talent. And so I think storytelling is extremely important for any company that's working with government. And it's not just storytelling of this is the narrative of the company and this is how we're going to be able to out recruit. Because obviously the types of engineers that are going to SpaceX or Hadrian or Anduril, they're in demand everywhere. And so you do need to be able to tell a compelling story and build a common culture and narrative so that you can get that talent. But it's also so that you can tell a story to the customer, tell the story to the government. The government cares deeply about the narratives of the companies they're going to be working with and sort of the mission alignment of the companies they're going to be working with. So I do think that is when you say, what sets apart brilliant technologists or brilliant groups of technologists who are working on common missions, it really is the ability to tell the story and to make sure that the story is authentic so that the customer wants to work with them.
So on that note, walk me through the first investment out of the American Dynamism project.
Yeah. So as I've mentioned, we invested in Hadrian, which is building automated factories and automated machine shops for aerospace and defense parts. And what's really exciting about what Hadrian is doing is I think, when you talk to space companies or talk to defense companies, one of the biggest challenges they have is this issue with the defense industrial base, the issue with the supply chain of how do we get these critical parts delivered to us on time, delivered in a way where the quality is acceptable and delivered without having to guess, without having to pick up the phone, without having to send a fax. In order to be able to meet the timelines that these companies set out. This is a common criticism of machine shops, of kind of the mom and pop sector that's been stood up since the last era of sort of space. And what I think is super interesting about their view and what makes them different than, say, other companies that have attempted to bring automation into machining is that they are bringing top-notch machinists and people who understand how to work within these machine shops together with software engineers, with the talent that you would sort of expect to see in a tech company. And so the thing that I've been tremendously excited about is that it brings together two worlds and brings together both top computer scientists and top machinists to solve a problem from first principles that otherwise hadn't been solved before. I mean, a lot of I think the attempts have really focused purely on software, have focused purely on automating 100% of the shop, and they haven't been successful or fruitful. And so it's exciting to see that Hadrian has been able to solve a crucial pain point in a very short period of time.
Yeah, the thought just occurred to me, but I know for a lot of industries left of the pandemic, like the auto industry and consumer electronics, a lot of them just ran on just in time. But as I understand it, and I am not an expert, so I will caveat by saying that, but aerospace, it was always much more disparate, right? It was just this massive constellation of thousands, tens of thousands of machine shops and mom and pop shops. And yeah, I've heard Chris talk about this, but if there isn't sort of the generational handoff, like if the kids don't want to, take up the family business, what happens to that part? So, I mean, I could see why this plugs a lot of gaps. And I like the way that you explain that as a hybridized approach. Where do you see Hadrian, to the extent that you could talk about this, where do you see it making the biggest impact first?
That's a great question. The biggest impact first. I mean, I can say the obvious impact we see this with a lot of companies that first bring software and first bring even just like customer support and customer service into industries. A lot of, I'd say, legacy industries just don't have that. I see it all the time with Anduril and the DoD. It's, we had no idea that even we would be treated in such a nice way, or that you would actually be able to supply us within 5 days with a working prototype. This is exciting. This is something like we've never seen this before. We usually just send off requirements, and then 2 years later we have something that doesn't work. And you've treated us like an actual customer. Thank you. And I think that's probably the immediate impact that customers are feeling now, which is, wow, like you're treating us like an actual customer. It feels like we're in the kind of the modern era of kind of how all of us expect to be treated when we're consumers of goods. But I think like the thing that I'm most excited about and that I've talked about at length is like, if we are able to, if Hadrian is able to build multiple factories across the U.S., the ultimate goal that I've heard Chris and the team talk about tremendously is we want to be able to bring people who are not those master machinists, people who are, I would say average workers, average people who are handy, who have an interest in machining, bring them in.
Don't have all the credentials.
100%. Bring them in. It doesn't have to be this sort of, 10-year apprenticeship to really understand how to work in machining. It can be people who, can learn the craft very quickly and work within a Hadrian factory and be able to, in many ways, I mean, and I know they feel this way about it, be able to serve their country. Like one of the things that I have talked about is that a lot of people feel like they do not have a mission or a purpose in this country. And you are either someone who has the CS degree who can work on these hard problems, or you're sort of left on the sidelines. And I think one of the biggest myths and mistakes we said was that people, everyone had to go to college, everyone had to have this kind of credential. And there's a lot of people who are actually exceptionally willing to serve their country in these companies that have focuses on work and supporting the national interest. And so what makes me really excited about companies like Hadrian is that it's not all PhDs from MIT. It's people who really resonate with the mission and want to build something cool. And I think we need to make it so that technology actually enables all people to feel like they are building something cool. And that's I think one of the sort of most important impacts that a company like Hadrian will have.
What they, when they're starting the business or pre-incorporation, what first principles, talking points they should ingrain into the business?
Yeah. No, it's an interesting question, because I think the especially for founders who are just starting out, I think the first thing that I always focus on is who is the team and how did you meet the team and how are you going to recruit the team? And this is something that I think is often under discussed, but in categories, any deep tech category, but particularly a category like space, as you know, there is just tremendous wars for talent. And every incremental person matters. And it's not just about telling a story, but it's also about, who do you trust in the industry? Like, do you actually believe that something is feasible? Do you want to work with these people for the next 10 years of your career? You see a lot of people building multiple companies together. And so the thing that I often focus on is, how did you find your team? It's a very simple question, but you'd be surprised how many people don't have a good answer to it. Who's your posse? Who are the people that are going to just like follow you to Mars? Let's be really literal about it. Like, who are the people that are, going to help you build your company, because it's going to be difficult. And, there's often sort of okay, well, we know the first 2 people, but what are the first 20? Who are the first 20? Like, where's your list? And I think like the best founders are constantly obsessing over that list. And so I think, that's where I spend personally a lot of time digging in with founders is sort of who are going to be the people that make this company great. And I do think that founders should spend a lot of time when they're talking to investors like myself, talking through why they've chosen those people.
Gotcha. I think that makes a lot of sense because, as we have mentioned many times, there's a lot of hard work, long hours in the trenches, and that's especially true for founders.
Yeah, and it's a simple question. It's one of these things where it feels like such a simple thing. Oh, like just we don't want you. You just want to talk about the people, but every investor will tell you that the team is the thing that matters the most, and sort of the origin story of how the team came together, how they work together, as many stories as you can tell of how how you're going to be able to build together and how you work together as a team and how fast you're able to make things happen. I think it's something that is just underutilized when you're talking to investors.
A16Z famously launched this services model, kind of like a LA based talent agency of a portfolio of value added services. So, and you have this lifelong knack and experience with storytelling and narratives and whatnot. So do you anticipate that being a lot of the work that you'll do with your founders?
It's interesting. So we often talk about the A16Z network of how we value relationships, how we value people, how we value companies that we can help put founders in touch with, that sort of thing. So we're very mindful that we have a network that can help founders, and that's sort of what we seek to maintain. We don't call it services; we call it a network. But I'd say, like in terms of, the ways that I do have sort of this, I'd say, modest view that like the founders that I've always been able to work with and that I've seen be extraordinarily successful, they don't necessarily they don't necessarily need help crafting a story. They don't necessarily need help, being introduced to various companies. Like they run through walls, and that's why they're extraordinary founders. So I would never deign to say that I can actually be helpful to the founders that I work with. But I will say, we're helpful. We're helpful on points as sort of being like what I call a Socratic guide, being a thought partner, being a sounding board, being someone who can spar with the founder, who can keep them honest. I think that's something that's really important, and that when the people I've been privileged with to see be extraordinary board members as well, like that's how they operate. But they don't build the company for the founder. And I think we're very mindful that the founders we work with, that we are in service of them. Which is why we love the term service and services, because we are helping them and supporting them, but they are the ones who are crashing through walls and paving the way and building the future.
How much might the space industry approve on its messaging or public image? And so I will add some context, because I think we have established a lot of ways in which it is doing very well, but I still think that a lot of the narratives that you see propagated are about just it being a billionaire's plaything, and just why would we invest any money in space when there are these problems on Earth? So curious if you have any thoughts on that.
So since the inception of the space program, like that has always been a constant issue. I actually don't know that narrative will ever go away, because it's so easy, especially in our society, to say that building might actually be a bad thing. And that's one of the unfortunate things in a society where stagnation has happened, is that a lot of people don't necessarily want to see people going to the moon, and they don't necessarily want to see that kind of progress. So I don't actually know that you're ever going to win the people over who are anti-space, and I think in some ways we have to ignore them.
I'll keep trying.
But I think in some ways you kind of have to ignore the extremists who are anti-space, because it means they're anti-progress. But what I will say is that I am more excited than I have ever been to see young people wanting to build these hard things, like I said, like there's just a generation of young people who are going to grow up with stuffed rockets, thinking that this is the only thing in the world is space. And the only thing for me to do is to become an astronaut or become an engineer. And like, I think that did not exist when I was growing up. And the fact that we have moved to a world where people see space as cool again, is just a huge amount of progress. So there's always going to be detractors. And there will always be detractors, unfortunately, in Washington too, because that's how the Washington game is played. But that's okay. In some ways, it means that we're on the right path.
What is your hottest take on the future of space exploration, or to borrow a term from your industry, the most contrarian belief that you have on commercial space?
Oh, gosh, the most contrarian belief,
or just hot take on space exploration. Dealer's choice.
I don't know that it's a hot take, but there's certain things that people say, oh, they're going to, it's 2015 and we're going to have autonomous vehicles on the streets by 2022. And, every car is going to be autonomous. And people really believed that. And of course they were wrong. And I think a lot of people are naysaying true space exploration. Like they think, oh, this is just a talking point coming from the people who say that they want to go to Mars. And I don't think people realize how fast it's going to be here. I think before we were talking about some of the other questions you had around what would you take to low Earth orbit, or what would you take if you were going to Mars and things like that. Like I actually think these are real questions. Like these are real things.
It's not going to be theoretical.
These are not theoretical questions anymore. Like, I've had the conversation with my family about, okay, like I think I know what age I will be. I won't share it here because I don't want to show my optimism. But like I know what age it will be when like we will theoretically be thinking about like whether we want to leave Earth. And like if we have to make that decision as a family. Like we will have to make the decision. Like who, like that's one of the things that like I think like our parents' generation probably didn't have to think about, or probably thought was kind of silly. But to have those conversations as a family in the same way that you would have the conversation about schooling or where you want to live, or would you actually ever, if we reach a certain age, like want to leave Earth? Is that too science fiction, or is that like actually like no, like people are going to have these conversations? And I don't know. I think that's exciting. I think maybe I'm being way too optimistic, but like I think we will get there. And it's something that both you and I see.
What percentage odds would you give it that the family will come to a consensus on low Earth orbit, the moon, and then Mars? I'd imagine, does the percentage change between those three?
The question of Leo, moon, or Mars, it's like what would I take? It's like I would definitely take,
or even why settle at Mars? Maybe beyond. Like
it's one of these things where it's like the most optimistic and the most adventurous person of the family may have a different opinion than the person who's pretty happy with the way things are. But yeah, no, I'd say families are a constant lobby, right?
Yeah, so maybe there might not be consensus, but that's good to hear that there's that optimism. And then last question, very, very much a change of pace, but does A16Z have a full-time chief meme officer yet?
I think you'd be surprised to find out who that is.
Okay. There you go.
There's a lot of people very, very talented at making memes at A16Z, and I won't out them.
Yeah, well, it's a key skill to have in today's world. So, Katherine, thank you so much for coming on Pathfinder. This was a great conversation.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. Thanks so much.
Alrighty, everyone. That is it for Pathfinder episode 0004 from Payload. Thanks to Katherine for expanding on the American Dynamism thesis and giving me some reasons to feel optimistic. I, for one, hope that her human spaceflight timetables and Mars settlement timetables are realistic. And a big shout out to Katherine for being our second video interview. As a reminder, Pathfinder is launched on video, and you can see my virtual reality rash, which is very real in all of its glory, on Spotify or YouTube. To get our future episodes, subscribe to Pathfinder wherever you're listening to this or watching. And if you like what you heard, rate and review us on Apple or Spotify. It really helps. Stay tuned for more combos that we have in the pipeline. And in the meantime, don't hesitate to slide into my DMs at ryan@payloodspace.com with any feedback that you might have. I'm Ryan Duffy signing off, and I'll see you back here next week.